In the second chapter of Paul's letter to the Philippians, after he's urged them for unity and humility, given them the great example of what God did for Christ when he was humble and put other people before himself, Paul urges the Philippian believers to do the following. This is in verse 12 and 13. He says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure." Paul urges them to do four things within this exhortation. First of all, he says, work out your salvation. And he simply means let your salvation shape your life. Work it out. May it permeate out into your life. This is one of the most fundamental things that we have to understand as Christians, is that our initial point of salvation, when we repent and believe, that is just the beginning of our Christian life. It's not at that point that it's all complete and done. We can shut up the book, close the door, look to what's next on our list of things to do in life. But it is our salvation at this point is just beginning. Our Christian life is just beginning. It is here at this point that our renewed perspective, our new understanding, our new way of life, our new righteousness and freedom and forgiveness should start to seep out into our life. It should start to permeate out into every aspect of our life as Christians. And it's also key to notice here, isn't it, that Paul is saying, work at it. Paul is not saying that this is an easy thing to do. He's saying you've got to work it out. You've got to let it permeate out and seep out. And it's going to begin with you working at doing this. This isn't just something that's going to happen. It takes effort. It takes energy. It takes time. It takes desire. It takes sacrifice to do these things. In the same way that 99% of people couldn't turn up just to run a marathon, it takes training. It takes time. You don't learn a language overnight. It takes time. You don't develop a great physical body overnight. It takes time and devotion and dedication. And it's no different with our newfound righteousness and salvation. It takes time and effort for that to begin to shape and change our life. And Paul is saying, work at it. Invest in this. Take time to do these things. It takes time for the unredeemed qualities of our life and our sinful patterns to be replaced by the fruit of the Spirit. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul is writing to Timothy and he says the following thing. "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." Paul here is using language that would be used for competition. He's saying in the same way that an athlete or a gymnast has to fight to keep going and to keep competing. And they've had to keep persevering to finish the race. That's what I've done. Paul uses this kind of language because he knows that to keep the faith, to keep going and enduring and persevering in our faith as Christians, it takes effort, it takes resolve, it takes desire. As many people seek to lead him astray, as many people try to give him new understanding and pull him away, as many temptations seek to avail him and squash his faith, he knows he has to keep going on and enduring. He fought out his faith, he worked out his salvation, and we have to do the same. Now, what does that look like? Well, early on in chapter 2, he's telling them what it looks like. It's obedience. It looks like thinking and doing and making and looking. He uses those kind of words to describe it. It means a new way of doing something in our lives, and it works its way out in obedience to God. And this takes work. Work out your salvation. But notice, secondly, he says, work out your own salvation. Paul says, it's not just in my presence do these things, but even more in my absence, even more when I'm not around, work at your salvation. Why? Well, because Paul recognizes that more often than not, it takes more energy and struggle and effort to keep going with something when those who are normally the ones who encourage us are no longer with us. Sometimes we have to admit, don't we, that we aren't easily and eager to keep going in our faith, to keep growing. More often than not, we become reliant upon those individuals, whether it be a parent, a spouse, a friend, a pastor, an encourager in the faith. We can become reliant upon them. And when they're taken away, suddenly we don't grow as much. We don't learn as much. We're not as eager and as passionate anymore. I remember as a kid watching The Simpsons, and there was a great episode where Homer Simpson, the dad, who was a fat guy, suddenly got a personal trainer for a role in the movie that he'd got. And he suddenly becomes really ripped and strong and muscly, and he's eating healthily because his personal trainer is there. But then there's this moment on the rooftop in the middle of this movie where the personal trainer says, I've been called away somewhere. And immediately Homer runs to this table full of snacks that's there for the filming crew and starts scoffing his face. And the director of the film has an absolute nightmare trying to find continuity between muscly Homer playing the character and fat Homer playing the character. But the point is, with his personal trainer no longer there, Homer just slips back into old patterns. And we can be the same in our Christian lives, can't we? When those around us have been helpful and no longer there, we slip into bad patterns. And Paul is saying, listen, you've got to take responsibility for your own salvation, he's saying to them. I'm not there all the time. Even more in my absence, you've got to work at this. Each of us, in exactly the same way, has got to take responsibility for our own Christian life, our own growth in knowledge of God and in our faithfulness. So let's ask ourselves the question, how are we doing by ourselves? What are we reading? What are we listening to? What's our prayer life like? What are we praying? How are we praying? How often are we praying? How are we encouraging others? How are we serving others? How are we growing in our faith, knowledge, and obedience to God? None of us has any real excuse for a lack of growth in our relationship with Christ. This passage here doesn't give any room for any type of excuse. It doesn't give any room for somebody saying, I don't know how, or I haven't got the time. If you don't know how, ask someone who does. If you haven't got time, make time. Our relationship with Christ is one of the most fundamental things in our life. It's the only relationship in our life, the only thing in our life that truly has eternal consequences, eternal ramifications. It's the one thing which has truly eternal significance. Our time in the office doesn't. Our time in the gym doesn't. Our work in the garden doesn't. Our understanding of Pythagoras' theorem doesn't. Our culinary skill doesn't. Our relationship with Christ is the only one, the only thing that has eternal ramifications. So let's work at it. It's not going to grow by itself. It's not going to happen if we just simply doss along, thinking it's going to be fine. We have to work at this relationship. And none of us can say, well, we didn't think we had to, or we didn't know how to, or we didn't have the time. No, this is our own responsibility. Paul says, work out your own salvation. And number 3, do it with fear and trembling. I think if we're honest, some of us have been coasting for far too long. We've been focusing on other things, and we need to be careful. For Paul reminds them that they are to work out their salvation with fear and trembling. Basically, Paul is saying, don't take God lightly. Yes, he's given us freedom. Yes, he's offered us salvation from sin. Yes, he's rescued us from judgment. But don't think that means that you can do whatever you want. Don't think that you can act however you like. Don't think that you can accept the forgiveness he offers and not pay any attention to him. He's rescued you from sin, so don't go back to it or be happy to live with it. And most certainly don't think God is a pushover. This is God we're talking about. The creator and sustainer of all things. The ruler and judge of all things. Don't treat him with contempt. But treat him with the honour and awe that he deserves. That's what Paul is saying. Do it with fear and trembling. Know who this God is. Don't treat him lightly. Friends, we have to take heart in this and be aware of this. So often we've just put our Christian life to the back burner, not paying any attention to it. And Paul is saying, don't do that. You can't do that. But instead, with fear and trembling, recognizing who God is, recognizing who the one that your trust is in, recognizing the one who has forgiven you and redeemed you and given you new life, know who he is, that he's not to be taken lightly. That we can't just think he's a pushover and treat him with contempt. But instead, value him and treasure him and honor him for who he is by working out our salvation. Finally, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, knowing it is God who gives you the power to do so. Paul finishes his statement with a helpful reminder. For many of us, if you're anything like me, will no doubt be wondering, how on earth can I do this? How can I grow in godliness? How can I shape this sinful heart and these wrong desires of mine? How can I manage these things? How can we possibly grow? How can we have any chance of resisting temptation and dealing with these sinful patterns in our life, growing in godliness, faith, love and knowledge? How can we do that? But the truth is we can't by ourselves. But that's why Paul says at the beginning of verse 13, for it is God who is working. Yes, as Christians, focus on growing, develop this faith, develop in knowledge, and seek to work it out. Devote yourselves to doing this. But don't do it in a way of thinking you're not going to get anywhere with it, but do it with confidence that it is God who gives you the power to do it. For it is God who is working. You can do this, Paul is saying, because God is working in you, both to will and to work. As you are devoting yourselves to do such things, it is God who is working in you to bring about these changes in your desire, that is your will, and in your actions, that is your work. Church, let us work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. Know that it is God who gives us the power to do so. And let's seek him and ask him to do that in prayer right now.